So we're doing land economics for gentle density. We'll have three kind of 10-minute presentations. So we have Tyler Bump, Senior Economic Advisor at ECONorthwest, Jeff Waters, Principal at Waters Development, and Madonna Blunt, Certified Residential Appraiser. So before I turn it over to Tyler, I'd just like to provide a brief introduction. So Tyler's played a leading role in ECONorthwest's missing middle housing analysis since he joined in 2019, building on his experience as an in-house economic planner for the city of Portland in the residential infill project, which included allowing 2 ADUs and middle housing in mini single-family residential zones. This experience has informed his understanding of best practices for both the economic aspects of middle housing regulation and the policy and engagement approaches that can lead to successful outcomes. Tyler supported local jurisdictions and state governments across the country to adopt meaningful policies and programs that support the production of a wide range of housing types to meet the diversity of housing needs. And with that, Tyler, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Rory. And bear with me while I share my screen here. I'm gonna have to on a single screen, so let me get this started. Okay, so I want to start off my presentation today talking a little bit about what we see as best practices for middle housing or gentle density zoning code development standards from a feasibility perspective. At a high level, holding middle housing to a higher standard than single family detached housing will tend to mean less middle housing production. And so really thinking about the relationship between single family standards and gentle density standards and really what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve is really important. Allowing middle housing types by right more broadly in different zones is important, but more needs to be done to make it possible for new middle housing to be created. So we do think in our work, if the goal is to see increased housing production, more diverse housing types being built at lower cost price points, that it is important to sort of think about these allowances jurisdiction-wide, citywide, community-wide as you're thinking about it. But there's also ways to think about making housing more feasible or more possible to get built, which includes things like process improvements, and then also evaluating some of the other financial implications of infrastructure requirements or infrastructure fees. Let me go to my next slide. Some other best practices here: density needs to be substantially higher than single family housing. And this really gets to, I know Jeff's going to talk about this at a site level a little bit later too. This really gets to lot size minimums and sort of what you're trying to get built, both in terms of physical scale and feasibility. Conventional lot coverage for single family structures, yard size and setbacks tends to be too restrictive for middle housing, especially when you're thinking about smaller lot minimums. Allow middle housing to use more of the lot than a single family home while keeping the overall house scale like. And this is really important when you're trying to hit that sort of Goldilocks zone between height and scale within a single family context. Impact fees, utility connections, street frontage improvements really impact feasibility. I'm going to share an example a little bit later on from a community in Oregon that we worked with that highlights the street frontage challenges. Parking is a big deal, predominantly from a physical standpoint of being able to fit the desired number of units consistent with your housing types that you're trying to achieve, but also has significant feasibility implications because of the amount of leasable or saleable square footage that you're allowed to build under different configurations or allowances. One quick note on review processes. So discretionary review creates a lot of uncertainty, slows housing production and adds cost. And so there are ways in which we've seen design standards and development standards being used as a clear and objective path to getting the design elements that folks want to see in terms of context and compatibility, but discretionary review adds a whole lot of uncertainty to private actors. Some solutions allow as of right, use clear and objective standards. And if you do have discretionary review, think about staff or ministerial level review as opposed to a more public review process or a commission process as well. All right, I'm going to share some examples from a couple places where we've worked. The next few slides are on Eugene, Oregon's middle housing code that we helped them with. And one of the things, I'm going to go through some of the feasibility analysis that we did and some of the big questions that came up as part of this project. One question and thing that often comes up is if you allow middle housing everywhere, you're just going to see mass redevelopment happening, mass development happening everywhere. And so what we did in Eugene is we looked at parcel level feasibility across the entire city. What you see here in this chart is parcel level feasibility results summarized by neighborhoods in the city of Eugene. And generally for feasible development, we're looking anywhere between 2 and 8% of parcels at a neighborhood level that are feasible. So there is housing production happening. It's meaningful housing production in terms of housing needed in the community, but it's not a level of change that is sort of overtaking the character of the existing neighborhoods. So the gray bars show the total parcels, total single families, residential zone parcels in these neighborhoods. The yellow bars show feasible development for detached single family development as was previously allowed under the single dwelling code. And the orange bar shows feasibility of parcels for middle housing types. And middle housing types here being duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes in that orange type as well. One thing to highlight is that just because you allow a fourplex and townhouse doesn't mean that those are the only things that are going to get built because they're the most dense. In our results, we do see a wide range of housing types that do get built across different communities when they're allowed. I wanted to one of the other questions was about redevelopment versus vacant lot development. So at a similar scale at this neighborhood level in Eugene, what we looked at is vacant versus redevelopment capacity. And so for each of these neighborhoods, we've got single family development feasibility and middle housing development feasibility. The lighter colors in each of these show vacant lot development. The darker colors show redevelopment. Redevelopment is much more likely to occur with middle housing and is consistent with Eugene in this case and their goals around built form and sustainability related to managing their urban growth boundary. And so this was a really important policy analysis for us to do for them to show that this achieves the objectives that they want, but also does so in a way that's consistent with their desired growth pattern for their overall comprehensive plan goals. One other note on Eugene, one thing that we did after the feasibility analysis, Planning Commission and City Council asked us, well, what if we wanted to see less expensive housing? What are the regulatory tools, the levers that we can pull to get more housing built at lower rates? And so two of the things that we looked at, they ultimately developed a code package structure that they titled Allow, Encourage, and Incentivize. And for the most part, two of the standards that they were looking at that had the most impact on production and affordability were minimum lot sizes. And you can see in this table on the left-hand side, how minimum lot sizes vary depending on each of those code packages for the housing types, and then parking requirements. On the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, the higher you get in terms of residual land value effectively being the land budget for a development of this housing type, assuming all costs and rents are covered for the development project. So this is kind of your land budget of the feasible development project. You see more development happening. That development is happening at a rate with lower cost housing as you see smaller parcels, minimum lot sizes, smaller units, and parking goes away as part of that because it's really, really hard to fit these housing types on smaller lots once you get to that minimum lot size as well. The city of Eugene did end up adopting the incentivized code package with some additional incentives related to areas that were specifically near transit with parking requirements. Another example that I wanted to share, just because it's a very diverse area, is Washington County, Oregon. Washington County is an urban incorporated county, unincorporated portions of urban Washington County. There are some close-in suburban neighborhoods, there are close-in urban neighborhoods, and there are rural adjacent neighborhoods as part of Washington County. So it was a really interesting project to look at the whole spectrum of context for which middle housing could occur. We took a similar approach in looking at this sort of neighborhood scale outcomes here and wanted to show that when we look at the feasibility of these different housing types across neighborhoods, we do see that there's different outcomes depending on the market conditions in each of these neighborhoods about if you're going to more likely see townhomes or plexes or continue to see single family detached development depending on what the current market conditions are in those neighborhoods and in those communities. What Washington County was trying to do here was to calibrate their code in a way to get housing in high opportunity locations. Many of those locations were high cost neighborhoods. And so they were really thinking about what are the regulations to put into place to be able to get more housing and a diversity of housing and less expensive housing in those high opportunity neighborhoods. I also wanted to share in Washington County here, this is the estimated feasible pricing of for sale housing units for each of these housing types as we looked across the entire community. So on the left-hand side, and I will acknowledge, because I do a lot of work in Seattle as well, that these prices look absurdly low for housing affordability in terms of sale prices, especially in much of the BC market. But these are real achievable for sale housing prices for new construction in the Portland region. For detached single family, about $600,000 to $700,000. Once you start to get some efficiencies on land prices and unit type, you can see the affordability improve substantially. So with smaller lot single family detached between about $400,000 and $550,000 per unit, townhomes more affordable between about $350,000 and $475,000 or so. Duplex, triplex, and fourplex, those are ownership units in a strata configuration, extremely affordable depending on the unit size of those two. And then the cottage cluster is falling a little bit in between the middle of that range for duplex and triplex housing types. One thing to highlight here, this is a function of both land efficiency, so spreading the cost of the land across more units, as well as unit size and density. So those are the things that are really driving the feasibility results for these different housing types where we've worked. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff, I believe.
Thanks for the presentation, Tyler. I think that was really, really great. I appreciate the kind of nitty gritty that you got into there. Yeah, Jeff, I'll just give you a little introduction. So Jeff is passionate about building homes and stronger communities. His ability to comprehend intricate complexities and weed out inefficiencies while maintaining a clear view of the greater goal has been honed through his work as a professional engineer and lifelong hands-on experience. As a trusted development consultant for projects through the Sea to Sky, Lower Mainland, and interior British Columbia, Jeff leverages his deep understanding of development, construction, and complex market conditions to help inform and direct clients through all phases of development while ensuring project success. In addition to serving the private market, Jeff helps support various nonprofits by advising on development feasibility and project management. And with that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Rory. I will just load up my presentation here. There we go. Perfect. So what I wanted to do today was really provide a few development examples of some projects that I'm working on at the moment, and then also just kind of piggybacking on Tyler's presentation about keys to success in gentle density housing forms. So first up, we've got a local example in Vancouver. This really interesting two lot, or I guess it is one lot, but two single family houses. So they were built in 1902 and 1908. One operated with a CRU and housing above. That original owner, when their business as the neighborhood grocery took off, built the house next door and lived in that for many years. And so what we did here, and this was a really interesting example that I wanted to highlight, given a lot of the communities that we've spoken to in our work with small housing, was really interested in character retention, heritage retention. How can we create housing forms from the existing stock and also preserve the look and feel of the communities? So that's, we're fortunate enough to work with a private individual who wanted to kind of have a legacy project like this, where we created something really unique while retaining the neighborhood heritage, but converting it back into something that would truly benefit the community in a market rental project. And so what we took was two single family homes, picked them up, moved them forward on the lot, added the infill building, which you can see in the middle photo here, and created from two single family homes to five market rental suites, and retained the CRU that had been operating there for 120 years. So this was a mix of 2 3-bedroom units and 3 2-bedroom. On this, you'll notice we were able to have a parking relaxation. So we have a secured bike room with over 14 stalls, so about 3 spaces per unit. This was facilitated just in terms of the proximity for employment and shopping, groceries, all the neighborhood amenities, as well as transit, being the location in the west end of Vancouver. So we're very eager to see how this works and what types of tenants will enjoy the space. One of the interesting parts to this building was all the heritage components that we had to manage throughout the construction process. This involved stripping off the original wood siding, removing the lead paint, refinishing it, and reinstalling it where we could, allowable by code. A lot of the new proximity to openings and enhanced code requirements allowed us eliminated some of the areas where we were able to reuse the wood siding. But both structures got an entire seismic upgrade, very robust structure. It'll definitely withstand another 120 years, as well as what's very unique is we're trying to meet the new energy codes, but we have had to keep some of the original glass pane windows. So wood frames, single glass pane. So the wall assemblies are quite challenging. So there's a few different lessons learned from this project in terms of the cost of heritage retention. It does look phenomenal, and hopefully in the next few months, once we get our professional photos taken, we'll be able to share those with the network if anybody's interested. And then the next project I've got here is in Kelowna, and so this is a 2-lot subdivision or 2-lot assembly. And I can't speak as if it's a done deal just yet, as it's awaiting the public hearing in mid-April for the rezoning. And so one of the neat things here was similarly taking 2 underutilized war-era homes, joining the parcels together, creating 8 2-bedroom townhouses and 1 bachelor townhouse. That's what you can see on the laneway on the top photo. And so we're trying out these this cool new product in the Kelowna marketplace. And so one of the areas here, and why we had to push the height up to 3, hence triggering a rezoning, was the need for meeting all the parking requirements. So we have 9 private parking stalls or parking garages and 4 surface stalls, including off-street visitor. In these garages, they are oversized, and we have allowed for ample space for a large pickup truck in the Kelowna market, as well as e-scooters and e-bikes, as well as making it EV ready. And so one of the unique things here was we've, in infill development, this area, a lot of the neighbors are existing war era homes that haven't been redeveloped. So 1-story, pitched roof, very small, lot size well underutilized, being within a 10-minute walk from the waterfront, and where there's 20 to 40-story towers going up in the coming years. And so what we had to do was really come up with a plan, and you can see that from some of our window placements overlooking the side yard. Was we used high clear story windows to allow a lot of natural light into the space without feeling like you were overlooking your neighbor, and also they weren't looking in at you. And so it was something that we wanted to be mindful of the transition that the neighborhood's going through and how that will look for years to come, as it is an area under construction. And lastly, yeah, this was middle market sale. So targeting increased affordability when compared to what was existing on the site, and just providing more housing options for people looking at ground oriented in that downtown community, as opposed to the hundreds of apartments that are coming up in the next few years. One interesting component that I did want to mention, and it's come up a lot in our work with small housing, was facilitating the developer and landowner partnership. So this project came to us through kind of friends and acquaintances, where the landowners wanted to see what they could do with their land. They had both lived in the property for a while and were since looking to move on from it. And so we've actually created a really interesting structure where one of the parcel owners, we purchased the land outright from them, but they reinvested some proceeds of that sale into our limited partnership. So they're participating in the development throughout the entire cycle. which helps build some equity for them and really allows them to be really an absolute critical part to the development. Similarly, on the other parcel, the arrangement that worked best for that landowner was utilizing a vendor take-back mortgage. This allows us to take title at the perfect time throughout the development process to make sure we can get our entitlements easily, being that we have to delete the lot line, while paying them basically to be our bank throughout the process. And this creates significant improvements to the overall project viability throughout compared to private lending, and therefore improves the returns while also building equity for the landowner. And lastly, wanted to touch on a few things in how these projects came to, and just stuff that we've been looking at for future projects and how it all fits in with key factors for our successful gentle density development. So alignment with the OCP and areas for densifications. How will this fit into the current and future neighborhood? That's been something that's been a very important topic for us to consider in our Kelowna project, and just how that works when there's small rundown homes beside, and then how does it look when there's perhaps another 3-story building there, and how will that interact with everybody in the next 50, 60 years. What we found challenging often in these small parcel developments is how do we solve for parking. That's ultimately what pushed us from 2 to 3 stories, was we needed to find a way to put parking below a unit while not sacrificing unit area and just pushing back towards a 1-bedroom with a private garage. This is also a thing that we're trying to balance, as you've seen from the 2 examples. One, the Cardero project only had bike parking, no off-street vehicle parking, and we anticipate that to be a success. So how does that align with the existing bylaw and the actual target market use for the end use of the building? As parking is one where we have to balance the current needs, but also looking towards the future where we can leverage those very walkable communities. Addressing the interfaces with the neighboring properties. This was one, as mentioned, utilizing those different windows and viewpoints throughout the building and trying to maximize the enjoyment of both the future units and the neighboring parcels. AC units, this has come up a lot now that it's becoming more common in British Columbia, where we didn't used to need to have AC. Certainly in Kelowna, it's very common, but in the city, looking at where those AC units are located and how that noise can impact those without AC on those hot days when the units are going full speed and the neighbor wants to keep his window open. So there's a lot of intricacies that we have to think about now. Existing infrastructure, where are these small projects going to trigger upgrades in the community? That's certainly something that's really important, as these smaller projects don't have the same ability to absorb large offsite costs while maintaining these feasibility. And then financing, sale versus rental. This is certainly a really interesting topic with today's interest rate climate, and just the what ends up becoming the most palatable to investors. And so that's it's been something that we've been looking at, and why I wanted to show 2 different market rental and a market sale examples, just in terms of to provide more context and hopefully answer some questions as we go on. And then also just looking at the impacts of approval timelines. I know our audience is local government planning, and so just looking at how lengthy approval process, or the impacts of political uncertainty, whether or not the project has to go to council or a public hearing. For our Kelowna project, we were really hoping to avoid it. There was mechanisms in the bylaw, but of course, with infill development, members of the public did have questions, which has forced us to go to a public hearing. Which I actually truly believe is a good thing in this regard. Hearing some of the comments, it also gives us a really great opportunity to address how we've designed the building to meet those needs and balance everybody's priorities. So yeah, looking at those are the super high level. There's probably multiple pages more, but I'll leave that there for now, and we can get into more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for a great presentation. Really appreciate the practical examples of development and some of those kind of land economics, highlights that you touched on in your presentation. Just before I introduce Madonna here, I just wanted to remind folks, any kind of questions you have about land economics, any questions you'd like to ask our speakers, questions about their presentations, things that you think might be applicable to your specific jurisdiction, for your specific local government, feel free to fire those away in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce Madonna. So Madonna's worked in the real estate industry since 2006, working in both project and property management capacities. Prior to joining Coast Appraisals in 2014, Madonna worked as a development coordinator for Van City Credit Union. In addition to being designated through the Appraisal Institute of Canada, Madonna's credentials include project management professional certification and leadership in environmental energy and design and building design and construction. Outside work, Madonna likes to hit the road and explore from the major locations to the most remote towns. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Madonna. Sorry, you're just on mute there.
Sorry, it's my first time doing this. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, so I live in the greater Victoria area in Saanich. I've been working as a real estate appraiser for the past 9 years, and I'm going to talk about financing and the role of an appraisal. Specifically, progressive construction mortgages and lender requirements, and also highest and best use, to give you an idea of what the developer has to think about when obtaining financing and how it relates to planning and zoning. And then I'll go over my own project, which is a garden suite that I built in my backyard during COVID. So the type of appraisal that I prepare for developers is called progressive construction. And the full amount that you need to borrow in order to complete your construction is given to you in stages, otherwise known as draws, as you complete various levels of construction. So what I do is I look at the drawings that a developer has for a project, preferably building permit drawings, but sometimes I'm brought in at the conceptual stage. So I'm looking at conceptual drawings, and I visit the property, look at the property, topography, size, setbacks, and I prepare an appraisal for the lender that shows the value of the project within the effective date that I've been given, which is usually the date that I visit the property. So the lender sees what the value is if everything is complete. So it's an as if complete. And then they get an idea of the value of the property and what they can lend. I work within the constraints of lender requirements, and lender requirements are specific for each lender. So an example of a lender requirement is if the property is mixed residential commercial, the primary purpose must be commercial, not exceeding 25% of the total area of the property. So my appraisal is based on what the lender is willing to accept within their requirements. Okay. So one of the parts of the appraisal, and the most important part, and the part that I think mostly relates to planning, is the highest and best use of the property. So the highest and best use of the property is an economic concept that measures 4 criteria. So what is legally permissible, physically possible, financially feasible, and results in maximum value. So the value can be financial for the developer, but it can also be the utility of the project. So your ideal, the ideal use of the property would be to maximize all of those 3 criteria. So legally permissible, the way that a planner can come in to this part of the appraisal would be to relax the rezoning process for single family zoned lots, allowing for more density. So I'm using the example of a, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. I'm using the example of 6 units per lot. And I've chosen this example because I live in Victoria, and the City of Victoria recently passed the Missing Middle Initiative this year. And the Missing Middle Initiative relaxes the existing bylaws and land use policies to allow up to 6 units per lot without rezoning. Another example of legally permissible, and I saw this on the internet recently, which I was quite surprised by, would be what the city of Minneapolis did, which was to ban single family exclusive zoning to allow for three family buildings on all residential neighborhoods across the city. So that's an example of what is legally permissible on a property and how this directly relates to planners with municipalities. Physically possible. So this would be topography, the shape of the lot, and some of the roadblocks that developers deal with in what is physically possible. I'm using the example of protected trees. I'm recently working on a real estate appraisal for an 18,000 square foot lot, which someone wants to subdivide. So part of my process is to look for other properties that are similar in size and utility and find out what is happening with those properties. So I found another property that was listed for sale that was exactly the same size as the one that I'm working on the appraisal for. And I contacted the real estate, contacted the seller, and I got an idea of what they are looking at as far as interest from developers and what their roadblocks are. And one of the roadblocks is the fact that the property had a lot of protected trees. So they literally had a developer walk away from that property. I know that this is different for every municipality, but to look at a protected tree and walk away from the property because of protected trees, this would be a roadblock for a developer. They have obviously dealt with this before and didn't want to deal with it. Another roadblock when it comes to developing properties is parking. And I'll give you an example of this from my personal experience at the end of the slideshow. Okay, so the other criteria is financially feasible. So this is where the lender requirements come in. Every lender has different requirements for lending. For example, if you're just looking for a mortgage as a personal purchase, the lender will require you to put 20% down, and then we'll lend on the 80%. But developers deal with a much stricter criteria. For instance, on a property without utilities, they would have to come up with 50% of a down payment. Other lenders require 30%, but every lender has different lender requirements. So this is my own personal experience with gentle density. It's a small garden suite. I live in Saanich. Saanich is just outside of Victoria, and they have a different bylaws in Victoria. They do allow the secondary suites in most areas. And then in 2020, they relaxed zoning and allowed people to build garden suites. So I built a little garden suite in my backyard. It has 1 bedroom and 1 den, a 3-piece bath and a 2-piece bath, a little attached shed, private patio, of height ceilings, quite nice. The main criteria for my garden suite was to conform to adaptable design, because my purpose for the suite was to age in place. So I wanted it to be wheelchair accessible. Most garden suites in Greater Victoria cost about $250,000 to $300,000 to build. And I'm just doing my taxes right now and adding up my receipts, and I spent about $288,000 on building the garden suite. My timeline, I was very excited to build it and thought that I would be able to submit my development permit application in the spring of 2020, and then COVID hit and put everything on hold. So I was able to apply for my development permit in October. And I obtained my building permit in May 2021. Some of the roadblocks that I experienced in building my garden suite were things which I thought were rather unnecessary. One of these is the zoning bylaw. The client will be required to register a covenant under Section 219 of the Land Title Act to prevent subdivision of the garden suite from the lot. So I had to put this covenant on my title. And of course, I have a mortgage on my property, so I had to go through my lender. So this delayed everything by about 3 or 4 months. And it seemed unnecessary to me, because if I ever wanted to subdivide my property, I would have to go through the municipality anyway, and they could just say no. So it seemed like a roadblock that was unnecessary. Another roadblock that I felt when it came to getting this garden suite built was parking. Yes, someone could park in my driveway, but my house is 100 years old, and my driveway is the typical driveway that slopes down below grade. And I really wanted to be able to put in another driveway for the garden suite so that you could get out of your vehicle if you had a wheelchair and just go right into the backyard. And there's plenty of space on my property to do this, but I was not allowed. So basically, if my mother-in-law lives in the garden suite right now, and if she legally parks, she has to park in our driveway, roll all the way out to the street, roll down the street, and then get into her path to go to the garden suite. So this is what I feel is an unnecessary roadblock. I obtained my occupancy permit in 2022. Building during COVID was not ideal, and it took a very long time. When it comes to economics, looking at building garden suites, I believe it's, for a homeowner, it's a great way to age in place. If I were to rent the garden suite, I could probably get $2,200 to $2,500 a month, not taking into consideration the interest on a mortgage. I could pay back my loan within 10 years. And that's everything for me. So back to Rory. Thank you.
Thanks, Madonna. Really appreciate the presentation, the deep dive on kind of the lending sort of things, as well as kind of your own anecdotal personal experience of kind of being a homeowner developer and developing a unit. I'd like to invite all three of our panelists to join us on the screen, and we'll kind of march right into our Q&A. And I'm just a reminder for folks to post some questions in the chat. Any questions you have about land economics at all, we'd love to hear them. So the first question I'm going to direct towards Tyler, and I'll invite our other panelists to jump in as well if they have anything they'd want to add. So the first question is, how can we look at reducing lot coverage setback requirements while still trying to limit the effects on existing character of neighborhoods, since the look/feel is a big deal for existing residents?
Very complicated question. And the answer is it kind of depends on your perspective. But I will say that I was just in a really intense meeting with, not intense, deep in the weeds meeting with some architects in the city of Seattle, as the Seattle long range planners are trying to figure out what they're doing with their single family code right now, to allow more gentle density housing types across Seattle. And one of the things that I think we hear pretty consistently is the desire to sort of limit height for most gentle density forms to 2.5 stories. You know, townhomes generally do need to be 3 stories. And I think that's part of the conversation in terms of allowances by type and form and compatibility, is whether you're targeting that 2.5 story form, which is a full, you know, half a story being a full third use with a gabled roof that sort of matches the character a little bit better, versus a full 3-story townhome. There's production implications of that, but I would say that in general, the height is really important. What I have found with single family development standards and regulations is that there's oftentimes really deep front and rear setback requirements, which cause big challenges in terms of thinking about design and the physical layout of multiple units on a single lot. So side setbacks generally, you know, 5 feet in most cases, or 10 feet in most cases is kind of what we're seeing for communities that we're working with. 10-foot setbacks in the rear, depending on if they're alley loaded or not alley loaded. Not everybody has a laneway to be able to access the rear and put parking in the rear. Frankly, every time we talk about the setback requirements, we sort of get to, I think, what Jeff and Madonna both highlighted, which is the parking issue, is how do you do circulation for parking, and can you have a drive aisle in the setback? How do you access the parking that's horizontally loaded on a lot or rear loaded on a lot? And so I guess there's the setback question, and then there's what do you count in terms of use within the setback? Can you count your landscape area? Are you allowed to do a drive aisle? Some of those more detailed aspects of the code are really important. We have worked with jurisdictions that have good intentions of doing front facade manipulation by having a sort of maximum length on the front facade, which is really challenging for longer front facing streets. So there's different ways to approach it. There's a lot of best practices out there from a design perspective. All of them have implications on what you will see getting built and the amount of housing that you will see getting built too, though. So complicated question, lots of complicated answers to that question as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's kind of a series of trade-offs there in terms of, you know, what you're allowing for design, and then how that influences the housing choices and the amount of housing that you're building. I just wanted to see, Jeff, Madonna, do you guys have anything you want to add to that before we move to the next question? Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
If I can add, yeah, it's you know, the lot coverage and setbacks did come up a lot on our Kelowna file when going through and through planning, and also talking with councillors and the public. One of the important things was, as we asked for more height, our side setbacks tripled. And so what we've been basically trying to show in one of our slides in a sneak peek for the public hearing is going to be a 2-story building with a gabled roof at the 1.2 meter setback, which would be the original zoning. And then we're at, I believe, slightly over 3, and we're a 3-story with a flat roof. So actually looking at the shading effects and just how that massing by basically tripling our setbacks on the side yard in exchange for that height, But of course, we couldn't go any further just because, still trying to make parking work on this. We had an original design where we had parking access off of the lane, but a bylaw requirement allowed only one access off of the lane, whereas we had a drive aisle and a almost a parallel stall on the lane that could have worked, but just as it didn't conform with the bylaw, we weren't able to use it. So there's a lot of tricky things as developers, and it's very easy to speculate on land value when you just look at the bylaw and go, okay, this is how much density, back of the napkin, here's what land value I can get out of it. But actually coming and planning it with all of these setbacks, coverages, and parking being the biggest one in these areas, makes it very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just noticing we're just about at the top of the hour here, and we are going to take a 5-minute break here just at the top of the hour. So we want to encourage participants to keep kind of adding your questions to the chat. We have lots to get through here. If folks are able to stick around, sounds like there's a kind of a theme here of an added layer of complexities, depending on kind of who the stakeholders are and who it is that's doing the development. Madonna, this next question I want to kind of flag for you. So if zoning allows up to 6 units per lot, like you use the example of the city of Victoria, but a developer or even a homeowner developer wants to develop only 4 units, will that be more difficult to get financing for if they don't want to kind of do the full 6, since 4 units might not result in the maximum value?
Well, so you're restricted by the design guidelines, which, you may not. Okay, so sorry. Basically, the square footage of the development is really important. So if you're maximizing the square footage on the lot and you're building 4 units instead of 6 units, you're getting very similar value, because so for 4 units, you might have 4 1,000 square foot units. For 6 units, you might have 600 square foot units or something like that. So as far as an appraisal goes, we really look at the amount of square footage that you're building, and we give value to that square footage. So if you're building 4 units and you're maximizing the square footage allowed on the lot, then the value would be very similar to 6 units. Eventually, I find there's eventually you get to a point where putting an extra suite in or putting an extra unit in doesn't add that much value, because you're already building a larger than typical square foot property. So yes, you'll get a little extra value for having 6 units, but as long as you're maximizing the square footage on the property, you are maximizing the highest and best use of the property. Probably not completely, because you could build 6 units, but in general, yes, you are. So, sorry, was it to lending? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's about financing. So if they were to finance 4 versus 6.
So my appraisal would take into consideration the amount of square footage that you're building. And as long as you're maximizing the square footage, your chances of getting financing for the project are very good, even if you're not building 6 units.
Great, awesome, thank you.
I was just going to jump in and add there. Sometimes you can't, when on specific lots, sometimes you can't hit the max density for a number of other factors. So for instance, in that Kelowna deal, we're at 0.08 FAR, which is in alignment with the lower zone. The zone that we're hoping to get the height is a 1.0. There's no way we could fit any more square feet onto the site. And so sometimes you just can't get that absolute max. We aren't encountering any issues with finance, but I think that was kind of where you were going with it, Madonna, that, you know, as long as you're pushing to what the overall overall metrics works, you know, I'm sure you can still get on a 6 lot or up to 6 units per lot. I'm sure if you had a really well thought out single family home, probably get financing one way or another.
Yeah, Rory, I'd sort of jump in here too and add, in some cases, we have found that depending on the market and where you're looking at, a 4 unit versus a 6 unit might be the highest and best use from a market perspective. Depending on what the segments of demand look like and sort of what that submarket is. You know, if you think about if you're allowed 4,000 square feet of buildable area on a lot, that can be 4,000 square foot units, or that can be 650 square foot units. And you might be in a market where, for larger ownership units, for example, where there's a premium associated with 1,000 square foot units versus 650 square foot units. And so sometimes that 4 units, bigger units, might be the highest and best use from a financing perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Next question we have, and Madonna, I'll turn this back to you from the audience. So trees are important to retain in urban environments to take up GHG emissions. Some municipalities have tree cash in lieu funds that developers can contribute to fund tree planting elsewhere, you know, in a public park or in utility corridors. Would that present less of a barrier to developers than having to get tree cutting permits?
Yes, definitely. If you I know when I did my garden suite, I had to have a tree survey and my trees measured, and basically a map of if there's any protected trees. I think I use that as an example because, I mean, I don't know the history of this developer and what he's had to do as far as removing trees and how they've restricted sort of his ability to develop a property. I just mean that that from what I learned from the seller, that was enough of a setback or a roadblock for him to not take on the property. I think what what his issue was is the time that it takes to get past these roadblocks. So when I do my appraisal is a snapshot in time. So it could be, and lending is based on that snapshot. So lending doesn't move with the market conditions or anything. It's a snapshot in time. So if he has to take the time to try to find a way to get past these roadblocks, then he's not interested, because we're in a market right now where interest rates are going up and values are going down. So that was enough for him to walk away from redeveloping this property. So anything that can be done to remove even the smallest roadblock will help a developer as far as wanting to develop a property.
For sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Anything we can kind of do to reduce the barriers on that front. Our next question, and maybe Tyler, I'll start with you on this one. It's about family housing. What are the impacts of family housing policies on feasibility for gentle density typologies? As an example, if a development is required to have at least, you know, X amount of 3-bedroom units, or at least have 1 3-bedroom unit. I think this question is pretty timely as well, because there are a lot of local governments across BC that are starting to put together family housing policies. So yeah, if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
I hate to say this again, but it depends on what the requirements are for a 3-bedroom unit. And, you know, a 3-bedroom unit doesn't necessarily dictate the size of the unit. There are implications for the physical design and the efficiency of systems within a larger development project. So if you're stacking units, or you've got some efficiency in side-by-side units where you've got utilities, connections in the right places, there can be implications for physical design. That being said, it is not one of the, when we've evaluated it, it's not one of the biggest breakers of development feasibility. assuming that you have some of the standards in place to be able to get some more units to work. And you really need to think about what are the trade-offs associated with that requirement, and sort of what are you giving back in terms of regulatory incentives to make that work a little bit better. And that might be in the form of flexibility of standards or setbacks and lot coverage, or it might be in more flexibility of floor area allowances to be able to get additional units. Trying to think, in Portland, we had a family size unit bonus that I don't think has been used yet. What has been used from an incentive structure of the middle housing residential infill project in Portland is a allowing 6 units on a lot when 50% of the units are affordable at 80% AMI or below. That has been used, but I don't think that the family size unit bonus has been used quite yet. We looked at, for the city of Los Angeles, actually, we looked at the impact of family size unit requirements on feasibility of lower density, medium density multifamily buildings, which I guess is the upper end of the gentle density spectrum that you're looking at. You know, once you get to 3-bedroom units that are over 1,000, 1,200 square feet in size, there can be implications, but it sort of depends on what the offsets are on the regulatory side too. I would love to get Jeff's perspective on that question too.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, not to piggyback, but yeah, it depends. Certain markets and certain locations, and just seeing, you know, from competitive analysis, this is something that we always look at when planning a development. Is, you know, what is everybody else building in the area, and you know what's actually had a lot of success. We've seen some really interesting mixes. Kelowna was definitely one that was challenging to kind of really see what was perfect there. As I was working on a project a few years ago where it was a large 100-unit building, and we were trying to figure out what's the sweet spot for the mixes in terms of in that community, and it was very challenging to see who's used, you know, was there a good uptake on 3 bedrooms? Was it just too big? Is that something in, if it's not a yard, or is it, you know, how many people are looking to live in smaller, denser housing forms, but still need 3 bedrooms? Certainly affordability comes into a big play, but looking at the what everybody else is doing around will give you an idea. If you know, we saw one where it was 90% studios and the rest were 4 bedrooms in an apartment building. It didn't make any sense, but they had huge uptake on those, and there was just enough. So you got to do your own due diligence and really seeing what works and what doesn't. Certainly on the affordable housing side, family units is definitely something that everybody's pushing for. And I think it's definitely very needed, as it's really easy to make an affordable 1-bedroom work in a project. But a family unit, it takes up a lot of area that you can gain a lot of revenue from.
Rory, I'd add to one thing that has come up in recent conversations is when you're looking at, you know, 2, 3, 4 units on a 5 or 7,000 square foot parcel, a smaller single family parcel, you've got relatively narrow floor plates for those units. And so if you are adding or having a 3-unit requirement, you're really going to have to think about that 3rd story and how to efficiently use a 3rd story, because the way that most of these units are at least configured that we've seen is that you've got common area, common space on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. And if you're starting to think about requiring a 3rd bedroom, you're going up to a 3rd floor, depending on what your lot dimensions are, your parcel building footprint dimensions are. And so I think one of the really important sort of regulatory incentives to be able to encourage that, even or allow it from a physical standpoint, is to think about that 3rd floor allowance, especially with a 3-bedroom unit, just because of the stacking and efficiency of narrow floor plates on buildings.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to the theme that you would have said before, Tyler, around kind of like bonusing in this series of trade-offs, right? That if we're going to incentivize those types of units and those types of family housing, that there needs to be some kind of trade-off there. Is that fair?
Yep, that's a good summary.
So the next question we have comes from the audience here. So it just says, and Jeff, I'll start with you on this one. So if lot coverage is high, like we talked about earlier, maybe not maximizing, but getting kind of close to that. How are municipalities and local governments dealing with stormwater management? So there are requirements for infiltration, galleries, rock pits, or gray water recycling, and are municipalities generally direct connections to their stormwater infrastructure?
This is a great one. It's actually come up a lot on a number of my projects. So most recently in Kelowna, as part of the development process, they had asked for us to validate that the soils on our site had enough capability to handle the drainage of stormwater for our site. So in meeting this, we just had to specifically address it in a geotech report. Usually it's, coming from larger scale construction, it's always great to have a geotech report, no matter what, especially in BC and on the coast where you are dealing with liquefiable soils in many areas. So looking at, that's how we addressed it there. Some other projects, we do have large detention tanks. That's been a bit of a challenge just in working with how that fits into the overall development. Where do you put that, being that it needs to be accessible? Some of the it works easier on larger where you can put it underneath a park or kind of common green space. But we've also seen really challenging restrictions, and it certainly gets more challenging if there's any below grade structures in dealing with stormwater. Some of the challenges that we've encountered in Vancouver was the municipalities actually asking us to effectively tank the foundation or tank the parkade, which involves putting basically a waterproof barrier around the below grade parkade, which then requires additional concrete and weight added to the structure to reduce buoyancy forces when that storm water rises. But it does make a lot of sense from a municipality's point of view, as without that, any water infiltration coming in would be basically pumped back into their stormwater infrastructure. So if you look at a global scale or a neighborhood scale, everybody's basically mining groundwater and sending it back to the city for treatment. So depending on the size, it's something that's important. I think what I would say for these small gentle density, trying to manage it on site without the need for large detention tanks, whether it's a rock pit or just well-planned backfill around the building, is really the key. Of course, when you start looking at the cost of these detention facilities and what the pumps, hopefully no ongoing maintenance, but just the cost of the tank itself, when you're dealing with 4 or 5 units, if it's an extra 100,000 that you have to add to your development, can really make a massive difference in terms of the feasibility, whether you're a landowner or whether you're a homeowner or a developer.
Jeff and I have a good tag team with these answers. We in Portland, and I've gone through this with the project that I mentioned recently, we have a stormwater manual that has a lot of flexibility for on-site stormwater management for residential development when you're not triggering commercial building code. And in a project that I mentioned earlier, we are managing on-site stormwater management through 3 point sources: 1 through a bioswale on site, and then 2 for smaller, just tank management for slower percolation into the on-site. And so the stormwater manual in Portland is actually a really good flexible tool for residential development for folks that are interested in that. I agree with Jeff, like once you start to get into tanked or intense infrastructure, especially in the scale of development, it's really challenging from a feasibility perspective, and it's really challenging from a geotech engineering perspective too on these smaller sites. It's a big barrier. Yeah.
I would also add, just on the topic of redeveloping and renovating single family homes. adding tanks like this, if they're have to be covered under the building in some way, basically super cost prohibitive if you have to dig up a portion of the building to add these tanks and then re-add it back in. So just looking at where those specific requirements are triggered. New development, it's a huge barrier. Redevelopment, it's even more challenging.
Yeah, thanks. That's yeah, I think that's a really important consideration and something to definitely think about as it impacts the viability of projects. I think unfortunately that's all we have time for, as we're just about at time here. Wanted to start by thanking all three of our panelists for joining us today, for your informative presentations and the great Q&A that we were able to participate in. I'm sure a local government audience got a lot out of it and really enjoyed it. We're really thankful for your time. I just wanted to flag for our participants in the session as well about our next session in the Gentle Density Network that's upcoming on April the 26th. Also stay tuned for the resources that we would have mentioned before as well. And then finally, the potential workshop for the CMHC Accelerator that we'll stay tuned for that one too. Lastly, the slides and recording for this will be made available for anyone that wasn't able to make it. And once again, thank you to our panelists as well. Great to have you guys. Thanks for the informative chat.